At a drama school in Boston, a 9-year-old girl was shaking so much on stage that the script fell out of her hands in front of more than 20 people. No one moved, no one ran to help. Only the mother's eyes saw that it was not simple nervousness, it was pure fear, a fear that trapped the child's voice in the throat. Emily whispered, with her mouth almost glued to the microphone off, "Mom, I'm afraid of him," as she looked straight at the drama teacher. The silence in that auditorium, the heavy air, the footsteps of the approaching man, were a blow to Karen's chest. What this mother would discover behind the curtain of that simple stage in the neighborhood would be so shocking, so unbelievable, that it would forever change her life, her daughters and several families in that community. But to understand how Karen got to that Saturday, when her heart almost stopped when she saw her daughter tremble in front of so many people, you have to go back a few weeks and look at the seemingly ordinary life she led. Karen Miller was 42 years old, worked as a nurse in a Boston hospital, did long shifts that left her legs sore and her head heavy, but she always found a way to get home and still prepare dinner, ask about her daughter's day, check her backpack, and give her a kiss on the forehead before bed. Divorced for 3 years, she lived with Emily in a small apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, with trees on the sidewalk, cars parked on both sides of the street, and that constant noise of buses passing by and children playing after school. Karen wasn't perfect, and she knew it. Perfect. She was always tired. Sometimes she lost her temper for silliness, like the shoe left in the middle of the living room or the glass of juice forgotten in the bedroom. But deep down, she had a single point that guided everything: the desire to protect Emily from any pain she could avoid. After the divorce, she had quietly promised that her daughter would not be careless, even if there was only one adult inside that house most of the time. She woke up early, made coffee, let the smell of toast and butter spread throughout the kitchen, packed her lunchbox, and even separated a note with a heart drawn to put in the girl's backpack. Emily, at the age of 9, was the ray of light in that simple house. Small, with brown hair tied most of the time in a crooked ponytail, lively eyes, an easy smile that showed a tooth still missing in the front. She was shy at school. She didn't like to be the center of attention in the classroom, but she transformed herself when she heard music. Since he was a child, he hummed the soundtracks of the movies he saw on television and liked to imitate the actresses of children's series. Karen melted every time she saw her daughter running around the room in an old dress she called a stage dress, holding a hairbrush as if it were a microphone. It was on a Thursday night, after a especially busy shift, that Karen saw a brochure from the neighborhood community center thrown on the kitchen table. The colored paper talked about a musical theater course for children, with classes on Saturday mornings. There was a photo of a group of smiling boys and girls, some holding theater masks, others dressed in costumes of famous characters. In the corner, in smaller letters, the teacher's name appeared: Daniel Collins. The text said that he had experience with plays in schools, that he had already worked on summer projects, that he was loved by families in the region. Emily, who had brought the brochure in her backpack, almost jumped out of her chair when her mother asked if she was interested. The girl's eyes lit up in a way that Karen hadn't seen in a while. The girl started talking fast, saying that some classmates from school had already signed up, that teacher Daniel seemed very nice, that he had gone to their class to talk about the course, and that he even sang a piece of a well-known song right there. Karen listened attentively, feeling at the same time joy for her daughter's excitement and a small lump in her throat at the thought of the monthly fee. Still, when he saw the way Emily held that booklet as if she were holding a piece of dream, she knew she had no choice. At least not in the heart. In the following weeks, the home routine gained a new center: the Saturday theater. The first day of school was one of those Saturdays that start with clear skies, the sun coming in through the kitchen window, and the smell of coffee filling every corner. Karen got up a little later than usual, but still made pancakes, turned them one at a time in the pan, while Emily talked endlessly about the song she wanted to sing. about the clothes she imagined wearing, about how wonderful it was going to be to have a real stage. The girl put syrup on the pancakes and already practiced excerpts of invented lines, laughing alone, making mistakes and starting over. Karen watched everything with a mixture of joy and concern. In many moments, she looked at her daughter and thought about how that interest could be a healthy way out of all the tension that the divorce had brought. Emily had suffered more than she showed it. She knew that. There were nights when the girl asked to hear stories from the time when her parents still lived together, and on others when she avoided talking about her father, as if moving away from the subject was a way to protect herself. Perhaps the theatre was a way for her to put out feelings that she did not know how to name. At the same time, inside Karen, there was a small voice, that voice that every mother knows, that always asks if the place is safe, if the people there are trustworthy, if there is nothing hidden in the smile of those who will deal closely with their daughter. When she parked her car in front of the community center that morning, Karen realized she wasn't the only mother trying to give her children these opportunities. The parking lot was almost full, cars of all kinds, from families who clearly came from different parts of the neighborhood. Some mothers were sitting on the concrete bench near the entrance, holding disposable coffee cups, talking about the week, about their husband's work, about the children's grades. There were parents in caps, younger siblings running across the small lawn, and a constant sound of voices mingling with the distant noise of a bus passing by on the main street. The community center itself had that typical old-school building, with exposed bricks in places, light paint a little worn in others, a United States flag fluttering at the entrance, and a mural with photos of events, Halloween parties, choir rehearsals, basketball championships. Karen held Emily's hand, feeling her skin still soft, her small hand trusting hers, and entered the main hallway, where the smell of cleaning product mixed with the smell of coffee coming from a vending machine near the front desk. It was there, at the end of that hallway, in front of a room decorated with posters of famous plays, that Karen saw Daniel Collins for the first time. He must have been in his early 30s, with light brown hair, a thin, neatly trimmed beard, a simple t-shirt, and a wide smile that seemed very much at home in that place. He laughed with a group of children who were already near the door, bending down a little to be at their height and making excited comments about who wanted to be a villain, who wanted to be a princess, who was going to sing louder. When he saw Karen and Emily approaching, Daniel smiled even more. He reached out to Karen in a sure, firm manner, and then turned to Emily, asking her name, asking what kind of character she dreamed of playing. Emily, shy for a few seconds, soon let go when she heard the teacher mention a piece she loved. The girl's eyes shone again, and Karen felt her chest ease a little. That scene seemed so ordinary, so beautiful, that it almost made the mother feel guilty for having had any kind of fear. The first few weeks followed a rhythm that at first glance seemed normal. Every Saturday morning, Karen woke Emily up, prepared something simple to eat, packed her backpack with a bottle of water, a snack, and a sweatshirt. The two would walk down the stairs of the building, cross paths with neighbors who were going to walk dogs or take the car to the market, and follow the main street to the community center. On the way, Emily talked about the songs they were learning, how Mr. Collins had a strong voice, how he made everyone repeat the same scene until it was perfect. Karen listened to these descriptions with a smile. In many moments it seemed that he had made the right decision. Other mothers in the hallway were always speaking well of Daniel. They said that he was patient, that he had taken many children out of shyness, that the children adored him. One of them, an older lady who came to see her granddaughter, even commented to Karen that she would have liked to have had a teacher like that when she was young, someone who encouraged her to express herself, to sing, to dream of a real stage. Each such compliment felt like one more brick in the wall of trust that Karen was trying to build around this new experience. But even when everything seems to fall into place, sometimes a small detail stands out. It was after one of these ordinary Saturdays that Karen began to feel a slight change in Emily. It was nothing explosive. There was no crying on the way out. There was no refusal to enter the room. It was something subtle, almost invisible to distracted eyes. On that specific day, the autumn wind was already starting to get colder. The leaves of the trees fell down the sidewalk, forming small yellow and brown carpets. Karen parked the car, waited a few minutes until the end of class, and chatted with a mother by the door. When the children were released, one by one they came out excited, talking loudly, holding papers with lines and excerpts of songs. Emily also left, but her pace was slower. His face was a little paler than when he entered, and his hands held the script tightly, as if they didn't want to let go. Karen noticed a thin layer of sweat on her daughter's forehead, her hair sticking a little to her skin, something strange considering that the morning was cold. She came closer, opened her arms for a hug, but Emily just pulled over quickly and already tried to pass. Karen felt her heart tighten. He asked in his voice as light as he could how the rehearsal had been, if they were singing any new songs, if they had already defined what role each one would play. Emily gave a half smile without showing her teeth and replied that it had been normal, that the teacher was just going the most important scene. The girl's eyes, however, did not follow the words. Instead of looking at her mother, her eyes fled, went to the floor, to the side, to anywhere other than Karen's face. Something like that made the mother feel a short butterflies in her stomach, like a warning. She tried not to be worried. She didn't want to scare her daughter or provoke a fight right there. But inside, a phrase came up without her being able to move away. Why is she sweating like this if it was cold inside? As they walked to the car, Emily's hand was wet, and Karen felt the slight trembling of her fingers, barely noticeable. Maybe it's just tiredness, he thought, trying to give a simple explanation, trying to control his own tendency to see danger in everything. She remembered how many times she had heard people say that a divorced mother becomes paranoid, that she sees a problem in any male presence around her daughter. That night, however, the image of the rehearsal leaving came back to Karen's mind several times. She remembered Emily looking away, the unusual sweat, the short answer. He remembered mostly the way the girl had pressed the script to her chest, as if she were protecting something, or perhaps trying to hold on to something so she wouldn't fall. And as she washed the dishes, warm water running down her tired hands, Karen found herself thinking about how the maternal instinct is often treated as exaggeration or drama. Am I seeing things where there are none? She asked herself silently, trying to convince herself that maybe it was just another one of those days when her daughter was more nervous because of the lines. The following days were relatively quiet, but Karen began to observe small details more closely. On the way to school, he noticed if Emily was excited or quiet. At night, she noticed if the girl took longer to fall asleep. During dinner, she paid attention to her daughter's every expression when she talked about drama class, and to every moment of silence when she changed the subject. There were times when everything looked the same as before, and she almost laughed at herself for being so moved by a single drop of sweat on the girl's forehead. But deep down, that slight tightness in the chest did not go away completely. He just hid behind the routine. The following weeks brought a complicated mix of normality and small cracks, like a wall that at first glance looks firm, but has a thin crack running down the middle. 2 weeks of classes passed, and on the outside, everything seemed to be going well. Karen dropped Emily off at the community center, talked to other mums in the hallway, talked about simple things like school exams, the news from the city, the cold that came faster that year. Many of these conversations became almost dream circles, in which mothers and grandmothers talked about Broadway, famous musicals, how beautiful it would be to see their daughters one day on a big stage, full of lights. Emily, in those first 2 weeks, continued to bring stories home. He told of the songs, the simple choreographies, the warm-up games they did before going on stage. The girl imitated the way Daniel spoke loudly, "Project your voice," and asked them to repeat the same phrase several times until the voice came out firm. Karen watched the sparkle in her daughter's eyes as she told these things, and it calmed her mother for a moment. If she were really in danger, would she talk about the class with that enthusiasm? This question came to Karen's mind as an attempt to ward off fear. At the same time, not everything was so open. When the subject came up in certain scenes, at specific moments in the rehearsal, Emily seemed to become more vague. One day, Karen was preparing dinner and asked what part of the play the class was practicing. Emily responded excitedly about a musical number together, but when her mother asked if she had lines alone with the teacher on stage, the girl just shrugged her shoulders and said that they were scene things, which she couldn't even explain properly. The tone of her voice became a little lower, and she changed the subject quickly, wanting to talk about a colleague who had missed a high note. This little evasion of the subject, this way of slipping questions, started to catch Karen's attention. It was not a cry for help, it was not an open refusal, but it was a different, heavy silence that was hidden between loose words. She began to notice how often Emily used the word special when talking about certain exercises. He said that the teacher did a special exercise only with some students, that there was a special moment when the lights were lowered. The mother didn't like that, but at the same time she had nothing concrete to point out, just a malaise. It was on any given Saturday, apparently like the others, that the fissure became clearer. That day the sky was cloudy, but it was not raining. The air was cold, the way that makes people walk with their hands in their pockets and their scarf tighter. Karen had worked late on Friday and was more tired than usual. Still, she got up, prepared coffee, put an extra sweater on her daughter, and drove to the community center. He left Emily at the door, waited for the girl to enter the theater room, saw Daniel greet the children with the same open smile as always, and went to a nearby cafe to have something hot and try to wake up. The plan was to return a few minutes before the end of class, as he always did. But for some reason, she couldn't explain at the time. Karen looked at the clock on her phone and decided to come back 15 minutes early. "I'll just take a look," he thought, as if that was enough to calm the voice inside that insisted on saying that there was something strange. He walked back down the sidewalk, feeling the icy wind hit his face, walked through the door of the community center, up the hallway he already knew so well, with the distant sound of balls bouncing on the court and someone playing the piano in another room. When he got close to the theater room, he noticed something different at the same time. The door, which on other days was at least leaning against a larger span or completely open, was almost closed. A trickle of light escaped through the crack, a lower yellowish light which resembled stage light. The sound that came from within was not the chorus of voices of children laughing, as on other days. What she heard was Daniel's voice, low, firm, saying something she couldn't quite understand, cut off by the echo of the room. And, mixed with that, a nervous laugh that she recognized at the time as Emily's. An embarrassed laugh, more like a breath of air than a real laugh. Karen stopped a few steps before the door. Her heart began to beat faster, so much so that she felt the blood pulsing in her temples. His hands became cold, even with the heat that came from inside the room. She squeezed the strap of her bag and took a step towards the door, getting close enough to touch her ear discreetly against the wood. What she heard made her even more confused. Daniel said something about trusting, about trust exercises, about how important it was not to be afraid at the time of the scene. There was a sound of footsteps dragging on the stage, as if someone was changing places, a small stumble, a sigh. She felt her palms sweat and quickly dried her jeans, trying not to make a sound. A part of her simply wanted to open the door without knocking, to go inside and see with her own eyes what was happening. Another part remembered the conversations with other mothers, the compliments, his fame. What if I come in and I'm disturbing something normal, she thought. already anticipating the possibility of being seen as the exaggerated, difficult mother, the one who doesn't trust anyone. She stood there, paralyzed, for a few seconds that seemed like minutes, listening to her daughter's nervous laughter repeat, as if the girl was trying to fit into something that didn't make her comfortable. The fingers began to tremble slightly. Karen felt the weight of a question echo inside her head. Why does he need to rehearse with her alone, with the door almost closed and the lights low? There was no clear answer, but the discomfort grew. After a few more seconds, the sound of an object falling on the stage and Daniel's voice saying that everything was fine caused Karen to take 2 steps back. The fear of being caught there, hearing behind the door, spoke louder. She took a deep breath, forced a smile that no one was seeing, and moved away a few more steps, pretending to play with her cell phone while waiting for the end of class. When the children came out a few minutes later, the door opened at once, as if nothing strange had happened inside. Boys and girls appeared with the usual energy, talking loudly, complaining about being tired, playing push each other. Emily came behind, with the script under her arm, her face more flushed, her eyes shining in a way that Karen didn't understand if it was excitement or relief. Daniel appeared soon after, said something about how hard they had worked on that scene, asked the parents to help their children memorize the lines at home, and thanked everyone for their trust. Karen swallowed, wrapped her arm around Emily's shoulders, and led her to the car. On the way, he tried to get some information. She asked if they had rehearsed in a group or in pairs, if she had stayed with someone she knew, if she had liked the new scene. Emily replied only that the teacher was practicing a special part with her and 2 other children, and that it was important not to make mistakes because it was the strongest scene in the play. There was something about the way the girl said special that made Karen's stomach turn. It was not the word itself, but the way, the weight, as if she were repeating something she heard without fully understanding. On the outside, Karen tried to maintain a normal, even light tone. He said that it was good to dedicate himself, that it was cool to have an important scene, but inside his heart was tight. Am I exaggerating? He thought as he drove back home, seeing buildings, buses, signs, everything passing in a kind of fog on the streets. Part of her wanted to believe that yes, that she was just a tired mother, who had lived through a painful divorce and now saw danger where there was none. Another part, however, repeated the image of the door almost closed, the low light, the nervous laughter of his daughter, like an insistent movie. At home, the routine tried to cover up the discomfort. Karen helped Emily take a shower, prepared a snack, put a children's series on television, tidied up the kitchen a little. The girl, however, was quieter than usual. He didn't run around the room, he didn't insist on turning on songs, he didn't use the script to rehearse lines out loud, as he did in the first weeks. At one point, Karen asked if she was tired, if something had happened. Emily only replied that the shoot had been pulled and that she wanted to be alone in the room for a while, hugging her favorite stuffed animal. Karen respected it, but when she saw the door to her daughter's room close a little more tightly, she felt a lump in her throat. She stood in the middle of the hallway for a few seconds, listening to the heavy silence coming from inside, wondering if she should knock on the door, insist on a conversation, or give space. What if I put too much pressure on her and she stops telling me things? She thought, afraid of losing her daughter's trust. At the same time, I had never seen her so withdrawn after something that in theory should be fun. It was theatre, it was music, it was a space to play. Why then that look so far? That night, while washing the dishes for dinner, Karen felt once again that strange sensation in her chest. It was as if something was out of place, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. She remembered Daniel's smile in the hallway, how he talked to the children, how the other mothers praised him. He also remembered the script pressed against Emily's chest, the clammy hands, the door almost closed, the low voice coming from inside the room. He put the plate on the colander, wiped his hands on the tea towel, and rested his palms on the sink, tilting his head, trying to hear himself. "Maybe I'm just tired," she muttered to herself, thinking of the long hours in the hospital, the heavy stories she saw every day, the news that came on television, always full of terrible cases in schools, churches, clubs. At the same time, another voice inside her, lower and more insistent, said that a mother's body does not lie when it feels fear for its daughter. Karen tried to silence that voice for a moment, but she knew that from that day on, she would pay attention to every tremor, every silence, every door that closed between Emily and the world. And without even realizing it, the first step towards discovering the truth had already been taken. The following week, Karen woke up on Saturday with a decision made. It was no longer just a discomfort in the back of my chest. It was not just a loose thought at the end of the day. It was a plan, simple and direct. She was going to get to the community center early and was going to see for herself what happened in that room when the door was almost closed and the lights were low. He spent a good part of the morning with his heart racing, trying to act as if it were an ordinary Saturday. She prepared coffee, sorted Emily's clothes, helped her daughter tie her hair in a ponytail as she always did, and talked about light things so as not to scare the girl. Emily was strangely calm. He didn't show the excitement of the first Saturdays, but he didn't refuse to go either. He just did everything in silence, answering in short sentences as if he was saving strength for something later. Karen noticed her daughter's hands as she put on her sneakers. The fingers seemed a little stiffer, but they didn't even shake that much at that time. The mother took a deep breath and decided not to bring it up there. There would be another moment. On the drive to the community center, Boston's sky was light gray, with no rain, but with that cold wind typical of late fall. The trees had already lost most of their leaves, and the ground accumulated layers of dry leaves that the wind pushed from one side to the other. Karen drove with both hands firmly on the steering wheel, but her mind seemed to be a mixture of prayer and questioning. She remembered all the shifts in which she saw mothers destroyed because they had not noticed something in time, stories of families who trusted strangers with easy smiles. When he arrived at the parking lot, he looked at his watch and saw that there was still a long time to go before the start of class. He handed Emily to the door, saw her daughter disappear down the corridor towards the theatre room, and returned to the car just for a few minutes, pretending that she was adjusting something. Then he took the almost empty water bottle that was on the vehicle's console and had the idea that it would serve as the perfect excuse. "I'll say I forgot Emily's bottle," he thought. A simple, common excuse that no receptionist would find strange. He returned inside the building with the bottle in his hand. The corridor was emptier than usual because most parents left their children and left to take care of other things in the morning. The distant sound of a ball bouncing on the court was still there, but the area near the theatre room was quiet. Karen walked slowly, feeling the footsteps echo on the linoleum floor. When he approached the room, he saw that the door was open and that some children were still organizing themselves on stage, tinkering with scripts, while Daniel adjusted something in the lighting. She called for her daughter, said she had brought the bottle she had forgotten in the car. Emily ran to the door, grabbed the bottle, thanked her quickly, and returned to the stage. Her face looked normal at that moment. No sweat, no trembling, but there wasn't that old twinkle in her eyes. It was as if she was just fulfilling an obligation. Karen took the excuse to lean discreetly against the wall of the hallway, some distance from the door, pretending that she was texting on her cell phone. It was in this position that she saw the dynamics change. After all the parents who were still there left, Daniel partially closed the door to the room, leaving it just leaning against it, not locked, but enough to create a sense of barrier. Then he asked one of the assistants to turn off the larger lights and leave only a spotlight directed to the central area of the stage. The strong light in the middle and the darkness on the sides created a strange atmosphere, almost too theatrical for a simple children's rehearsal. Karen felt the temperature of the hallway drop. Or maybe it was just her blood getting colder. The smell of stage dust, which had been mixed with the smell of old wood, escaped through the crack in the door, making her remember old theatres she had been in as a young woman. From inside, Daniel's voice came lower, deeper, talking about a special trust exercise he would do with only 3 children that day. Karen's ear clearly caught Emily's name among the calls, along with that of 2 other girls. Karen's hands began to shake as they held the phone. It was a fine tremor, the kind of tremor that comes when the body senses danger before the mind admits it. She stood motionless by the door, feeling her heart beat so fast that it felt like someone was knocking on the chest door from the inside. The focus of light made elongated shadows project on the floor of the room, visible through the crack. She could see bits of movement, a foot shifting, a script being placed on a chair, the reflection of a child's face passing through the spotlight and fading back into the dim light. Daniel's voice continued, now softer, using words about confidence, about how important it was for children not to be afraid to surrender to the scene, about how often the audience did not understand the process of building a play. Karen heard interruptedly a command for the girls to close their eyes and let him lead the dynamic. With each sentence like that, her stomach seemed to twist a little more. Why does special always mean almost closed door? He thought, with a resentment that mixed fear and anger. She took a discreet step towards the crack, trying to see better without being seen. The dim light made everything a little blurry, but at one point she could see Emily's arm advancing towards the light, as if she was following some instruction. Then another command came from Daniel's voice, asking them to trust him, not to move until he said so, to remember that everything that happened inside stayed there because it was the safe space of the theater. The word safe sounded like a slap in Karen's face. Her breathing became short, almost a breath. A cold sweat began to appear on the back of his neck and forehead, even with the corridor relatively cold. For a moment, he thought about opening the door for good, entering and ending that special exercise there, in front of everyone. But the fear of making mistakes, of being accused of destroying the group's artistic work, held her back. She recalled all the times she was called exaggerated, controlling, a mother who wants to be in everything. If I go in without any proof, they'll say I've gone crazy, he thought, his throat dry. Still, he didn't get out of there. He watched, listening to each piece of sentence, trying to assemble the picture with the few elements he had. The room seemed to breathe a different, heavy air, and every nervous laugh of the children was muffled, as if it were being pushed down by the force of that concentrated light. The minutes passed slowly, and for Karen, every second seemed like an eternity. She held her phone so tightly that her fingers hurt, as she struggled with her own will to push the door open and end it once and for all. It was not discovered at that time, but it was very close. At one point, one of the assistants left the room to get something from the sound booth and almost bumped into her in the hallway. He made a quick sign of apology, walked in a hurry without giving much importance to the presence of that apparently distracted mother. Karen, however, felt her heart rise to her throat. This encounter almost made her retreat, leave, pretend that nothing was wrong. But the memory of the script falling out of Emily's hands at that other rehearsal, the image of her daughter shaking on stage, the look of fear in the girl's eyes kept her there. The special exercise finally came to an end a few minutes later, and the lights in the room returned to normal. Karen stepped away from the door, pretending to play with her phone again, to make it look like she had just arrived. When the children left, they were panting, some laughing, others walking in silence. Emily came out with a slightly redder face, her hair sticking to her forehead, her eyes shining in a strange way, not exactly happy but not in tears either. Karen felt a twinge of panic, the feeling that she was getting closer and closer to something serious, but still had nothing in her hands but sensations. That afternoon, the tension did not subside. It seemed that everything inside her pointed to the same place, but at the same time, something always prevented her from seeing completely. When she returned home, the feeling of opportunity and fear mixed still stuck in her chest. It was as if he was walking towards a door that opened millimeters, but never enough to show the entire room. And even without definitive proof, Karen already knew that she could no longer return to her previous state of calm. From then on, every little chance to see what was happening behind the curtain would be seized, no matter how risky it was. On another Saturday, once again Karen decided to arrive early. The idea now was to try to film something through the crack in the door. He felt bad for thinking about taking out his cell phone and recording it without anyone knowing, but the anguish of not having any concrete proof weighed more. He left Emily in class, made the usual way to the corner cafe, but this time he didn't even ask for anything. He entered, took a quick turn just to keep up with the custom, and soon returned to the community center. The clock marked a time when he knew that the special exercises in recent weeks usually took place. As he approached the hallway, he heard the music slowly turning off, the sound of footsteps calming down, Daniel's voice calling some children by name. He recognized his daughter's name in the middle. His heart raced. Karen walked slowly, trying not to attract attention, and stopped a few inches from the door of the theater room. Once again, the door was just leaning against it. A thin line of light came out of the crack, and now the corridor seemed even quieter than before. She took a deep breath, took her phone out of her pocket, and held it at chest level, as if she were just looking at something on the screen. The music stopped for good inside, and the teacher's voice filled the room, muffled by the wood, but still audible to anyone as close as she was. He talked about the scene of fear, about demanding truth from the body, about how the actors had to surrender to these emotions so that the audience would believe. Karen felt the back of her neck stand on end. There was something wrong in his tone, a strange insistence. She slid her body a little to the side until she found an angle where she could see a larger part of the interior through the crack. He saw pieces of children's bodies moving on stage. Daniel stared the children in the face, with his hands on his hips, gesticulating. At one point, he asked two of the girls to sit further back in the shade and called Emily to the center, closer to the light, saying he wanted to work on a specific moment in her monologue. The girl obeyed, walked to the focus. From what Karen could see, Emily kept her arms close to her body, her shoulders a little shrugged. The posture seemed tense. It was the moment Karen had been imagining for days. The moment when I could discreetly lift the cell phone, bring the camera closer to the crack, and record at least the audio, perhaps some piece of image of this trust exercise. Her hands were sweating, and a slight tremor made any movement more difficult. Still, she took a deep breath, rested her foot better on the floor, and began to slowly lift the device towards the crack, trying not to touch the door so as not to make noise. What she didn't expect was to be interrupted by something so simple. Just the second the cell phone was halfway there, a father came walking down the hall, talking loudly on the phone. He was talking about a football game, about a scoreboard, without realizing that his voice resounded and broke the tense silence of that space. He passed by Karen, made a quick gesture, and continued to the end of the corridor, waiting for the time to pick up his son in another activity. His noise completely disrupted the attempt to blend into the environment. Karen, frightened, put down her cell phone at the same time, out of pure reflex. The fear of being seen filming, of someone asking what she was doing at that exact point, made her retreat. To make matters worse, Daniel, from inside, seemed to notice the sound of the man on the phone and in a quick movement signaled for someone to close the door to the room. The crack closed all at once, the dry click of the doorknob echoing in the hallway like a verdict. Suddenly, there was no more light leaking, there was no more shadow, there was no more angle to film. The feeling that took over Karen at that moment was one of helplessness. She stood still, holding her cell phone as if it were a useless object, feeling her face heat up with anger mixed with frustration. It seemed that everything conspired for me not to see, he thought, with a lump in his throat. Her heart was beating so hard that she thought anyone passing by the corridor could hear it. At the same time, the cold sweat came down her back, leaving her blouse damp. She moved a little away from the door, leaned against the cold walls of the hallway, and began to ask herself questions in silence. I wonder what is happening in there. Why does he insist so much on these special exercises? Why always the same feeling of closed door, low light, secret? Each question seemed to hit a concrete wall. The fact was that once again, she was in the right place at the right time, but just inches away from getting something concrete. And even so, the proof slipped through his fingers. The time until the end of the class seemed to drag on. Karen looked at her watch and felt that the minutes were not passing. The sounds inside became quieter, as if they had moved to a part of the rehearsal where they didn't need so much voice. This made her even more restless. When they speak softly like that, it's what scares me the most, she thought, pressing her fingers against her cell phone until she felt pain. When the door finally opened, the first thing she noticed was Emily's face. The girl's eyes were shining, not as if she had just laughed, but as if she had held back tears and not let it fall. Her cheeks were red, and her lips were a little tight. Karen walked up to her daughter and asked if everything was okay, if the class had been difficult. Emily replied that they had rehearsed a very sad scene, which is why she had her eyes like that. She said she was messed with the character's story, trying to justify her downcast countenance. These explanations could suffice in many contexts. Theatre really stirs feelings. Scenes of pain can make a child more serious for a few hours. But to Karen, that justification sounded like a ready-made outfit that someone had given her daughter to wear. The way Emily avoided detailing the scene, how she changed the subject quickly, how she walked quickly towards the exit, with the script pressed against her body again, reinforced the feeling that there was another truth hidden there. In the car, on the way home, the atmosphere became heavy. On the radio, some song was played that Karen couldn't even quite understand. Her head was full of phrases that had not been said. I thought about the moment when I had my cell phone almost in the right position. I remembered my father talking loudly in the hallway, the door closing, that chance disappearing. I could almost feel the recording that didn't happen, the video that wasn't made. And with that memory came anger at herself for not having been faster, braver, more decisive. I should have filmed it with him there, he thought, fighting with himself. Emily, in the next seat, looked out the window as if she were somewhere far away. Her hands rested on her lap, cold, and Karen noticed a small movement in her fingers, a kind of suppressed trembling. At one point, the mother asked directly if her daughter was really enjoying the course, if she wanted to continue. Emily hesitated, swallowed, and replied that she did not want to disappoint Mr. Collins, who he said she had a talent for the most difficult scene. This phrase in particular kept hammering in Karen's head. At night, the theatre also began to invade the space that should be the safest, the house. A few days after that failed attempt to catch her, Karen noticed that Emily was more reserved in the late afternoon, especially when she locked herself in her room with the script in her hands. At first, she thought that her daughter was just practicing her lines, as any child would do, but on one of those nights, while preparing dinner, he heard a phrase repeating itself and, unintentionally, stopped in the middle of the corridor to pay attention. Emily's voice was muffled through the door, as if she were standing in the middle of the room, talking to someone invisible. The girl repeated a sequence of words about not telling anyone, about trusting the director, about not ruining the scene with fear. The problem is that the tone didn't sound like someone else, playing at interpreting. There was a tremor in some words, a heavier breath at the end of the sentences. Karen felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. She slowly approached the half-open door and saw her daughter standing in the middle of the room, holding the script open, but looking straight ahead, not at the paper. Emily spoke as if she was hearing these words from someone and just reproducing. He said things like, "You trust me, don't you? And there are things that the public will never understand, so it's better to stay between us." Karen touched her hand on the doorknob without making a sound, and took a deep breath, trying to decide whether to enter at that moment or just observe. When the girl finished repeating the phrase, "Don't tell your mother, she won't understand," she was silent for a second, as if these words had some bitter taste. It was at that moment that Karen felt an intense cold come down her spine. That was no longer just a script. That particular phrase, about not telling his mother, seemed to cut straight through the most important bond in that house. "Where is she getting this from?" he thought, with such a tightness in his chest that he almost had to lean on the wall. Emily noticed her mother's presence and quickly closed the script, forcing a smile. He said that he was just memorizing a difficult part, that he didn't even like that line very much, but that it was important for the play. Karen entered the room, looked into her daughter's eyes, tried to smile back, but felt her own expression failing. Emily's hands were cold, cold indeed, as her mother stepped over to adjust the collar of her blouse. An uncomfortable silence took over the room for a few seconds, until Karen suggested they take a break for dinner. That night, after they had eaten, Emily ordered something that hadn't been part of the routine for a long time. She said she was afraid to sleep alone, that every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dark stage, the bright light, the shadows, and felt her body tremble again. He asked to sleep in his mother's bed, as he did when he was even younger, on stormy days or when he was sick. Karen didn't think twice. She pulled the blanket, made room next to it, let her daughter curl up next to her, bringing her favorite stuffed animal with her. Lying there, with Emily tucking her face into her shoulder, Karen felt the girl's hands, again, colder than usual. The small body trembled slightly, like someone who is trying to warm up after leaving a very cold place. The mother slowly ran her hand through her daughter's hair, in a gesture she always used to calm her down, and at the same time made a silent monologue to herself. "I'll get you out of there, whatever the cost," he promised in thought, looking at the ceiling of the room dimly lit by the light of the lamp. No mother wants to believe that the place where her child learns, sings, plays, and lives with other children can become a space of fear. But at that moment, lying next to her daughter, listening to her breathing become a little calmer, Karen felt that she had already passed the point of return. There was no longer any way to justify everything with fatigue, stage nervousness, or artistic sensitivity. The theatre had entered the house, in the repeated lines of secrecy and blind trust, in the nightmares, in the request to sleep, clinging to her mother. She closed her eyes for a few moments, but could not close her eye. Each time sleep threatened to arrive, the image of the almost closed door returned, along with Daniel's voice saying that it was a safe and special space. The words secret and trust repeated in his mind, creating an uncomfortable echo. She spent a good part of the night awake, just listening to her daughter's breathing, checking if she was okay, if she didn't have another nightmare. And as the hours passed, the decision that was once just a feeling began to take shape as a more concrete plan. If that story had reached so deep in you, it's because you know the weight of seeing a child carrying a fear that you can't explain. What came next in Karen and Emily's lives would have the power to stir even more any mother who ever suspected something and was called exaggerated. And that's why this story couldn't be stopped before the discovery of what really happened behind that curtain. In one of the few lull intervals the following week, when Emily was already at school and the house was quiet, Karen decided she couldn't face it all alone. She thought about who she could talk to without being immediately judged as paranoid. He remembered some mothers he met in the corridor of the community center, but one face came to mind more strongly, that of Linda, a slightly older mother, with a firm look and a calm manner, who had an older daughter in the same course, an 11-year-old girl who had been doing theatre there for a longer time. That Saturday, Karen purposely waited a few more minutes at the end of class to observe the other mothers. He saw Linda arrive, with her long coat, a large bag on her shoulder, and her hair tied in an unpretentious bun. Linda had that way of someone who has seen a lot and was not so easily impressed by small problems. She was the kind of woman who held her car keys safely, who guided her daughter in short, clear sentences, bluntly but with affection. When the children left, Karen approached, started a conversation with some banality about the traffic, about the cold that was getting worse. Linda replied with a polite smile, and the two of them stood there exchanging quick sentences while waiting for their daughters to pick up their things. After a few minutes, Karen plucked up the courage and asked if Linda had time to have a coffee nearby, because she wanted to talk about something about the course. The other woman hesitated, looked at her watch, but ended up agreeing, saying that she could stay a while before continuing with the afternoon commitments. The two went to a nearby Starbucks, one of those places full of people with laptops, couples talking, young people playing with their cell phones. The strong smell of freshly ground coffee filled the room, mixed with the noise of the espresso machine and the low conversations at the surrounding tables. They sat at a table near the window, from where they could see the movement of the street, the cars passing by, the people entering and leaving the shops. For a few minutes, they talked about neutral things. They commented on the girls' school, on the tests, on the difficulty of reconciling work and children's routine. Karen took a deep breath, stirring the coffee with her spoon, even without sugar, just so she had something to do with her hands, until he decided to get straight to the point. She said that in the last few weeks she had felt strange about some things in the course, that she noticed Emily more tense, quieter, and that some phrases about secrets and trust had begun to appear insistently. Linda, at first, seemed to put herself in the position of defense. She said that Daniel was a good teacher, that her daughter loved the course, that it had been a watershed in the girl's life, who was very insecure before. She said that sometimes the theatre really stirred emotions, that some children were more sensitive, but that this was normal. Karen listened patiently, without interrupting, although she felt a strong urge to say, "That's not all." She then began to tell specific details. He spoke of the day he arrived early and saw the door almost closed, the light low, his voice doing a special trust exercise with only 3 children, including Emily. She told about the phrases she heard her daughter repeat in the room, talking about not telling her mother anything, about trusting the director, about things that were just there. She reported the request to sleep in her mother's bed, the nightmares about the dark stage, the cold hands. He did not exaggerate his words, he just narrated each point, one by one. As Karen spoke, Linda's expression began to change. The initial smile disappeared, giving way to a more serious, attentive look. At one point, the other mother leaned back on the chair, crossed her arms, and was silent for a few seconds, as if she were rearranging old memories. Then she let out a deep sigh and said something Karen didn't expect to hear so soon. He said that his own daughter, a few months earlier, had mentioned that she did not like very much certain strange exercises that the teacher did. Linda explained that, at the time, the girl described these exercises as moments when Daniel asked some students to stay very close to him in scenes of fear with the darker room, and insisted that they not look away, even if they felt uncomfortable. He said that his daughter once commented in a shy way that she did not like it when he asked not to comment with her parents about how they built the truth of the scene. At the time, Linda had thought it was just theatrical language, that perhaps her daughter was misinterpreting. "I always thought it was something in my girl's head," she confessed, with a trace of guilt in her voice. That sentence fell between the two of them as a shared weight. The two looked at each other in silence for a few seconds, as if they had seen at the same time the size of the problem. She was no longer just Karen's daughter. She was not an isolated case. There was a pattern being drawn. The word strange, used by 2 girls in similar contexts. The idea of exercises in the dark, of secret and special, of topics that could not be shared with their mothers. All of this began to connect in Karen's mind like pieces of an unpleasant puzzle. The conversation deepened. Linda admitted that in recent weeks she had noticed her own daughter more serious on drama school days, but had attributed it to pre-adolescent fatigue or worries. He said that now, listening to Karen, he saw that perhaps he had ignored important signs. The two began to ask each other questions, exchanging details that perhaps, on their own, did not seem so serious, but which, placed side by side, formed a much more troubling picture. It was there, at that coffee table, with both hands around the warm glass, that Karen realized she was no longer alone in her mistrust. Linda now no longer spoke with the same confidence about the teacher. Instead of defending, he began to agree that something needed to be watched more carefully. The two decided that they couldn't just keep feeling afraid and keeping everything to themselves. Something had to be done. Karen suggested that, in the next rehearsal, one of them should get closer to the backstage, offering help, while the other would stay in the hallway area, near the door, to observe any suspicious movement. Linda agreed promptly. A new alliance was born there, not only between two mothers, but between two women who, like so many others, had learned to doubt their own intuition so as not to be called exaggerated, but who now saw the need to recover that inner voice. Before they said goodbye, Linda lightly touched Karen's hand, as if making a gesture of silent support. He said that if something was really wrong, they wouldn't let it go. That no matter how much the teacher was loved in the neighborhood, there is no greater respect than what is due to a child, and that, if they were wrong, at least they could sleep peacefully afterwards, knowing that they tried to protect. They left the cafe with their weight still on their chests, but with a new feeling. I was no longer an isolated mother struggling with their own thoughts. It was a beginning of the group, still small, but firm. In the following days, the decision began to turn into concrete action. Karen didn't want to wait any longer, until her daughter's fear became a clear scream. I wanted to act before that. He went to a simple electronics store in a nearby mall during a work break and bought a small audio recorder that could be attached like a keychain. The salesman explained how it worked, showed that it was enough to press a discrete button to start recording and another to stop, and that the battery lasted for hours. Karen listened carefully, feeling her hands sweat inside her bag, even standing there in such an ordinary place. When she got home, she examined the tape recorder calmly, sitting at the kitchen table. It was small, discreet, silver, with a shape that really resembled a keychain. She knew that, in a way, she was breaking a delicate line by involving her daughter in a recording without the girl knowing. But at the same time, I felt like I needed something more than assumptions and loose phrases repeated in the bedroom. He needed to hear clearly what was said on that dark stage, in the moments when the door was almost closed. The following Saturday, Boston's skies dawned even tighter, with dense clouds and a biting wind. As she packed Emily's backpack, Karen held the small tape recorder in her hands and felt her heart beating faster. He called his daughter in the kitchen and showed the object as if it were a simple ornament. He said he had seen that cute keychain in the store and found her face to hang in her backpack at the theater. Emily looked, found the shine of the metal interesting, took the keychain in her hands and smiled, albeit discreetly. Karen attached the recorder to one of the inside straps of the backpack in a way that would be hidden, but with the microphone facing outwards. With every movement he made, he felt his fingers tremble. A voice inside asked if he wasn't going too far. Another replied that there was nothing further than letting her daughter remain afraid without trying to understand where he came from. As she zipped up, she made a silent promise. "I just want the truth. I don't want to invade your life, my daughter. I want to protect your life." In the car, on her way to the community center, Karen glanced quickly at her backpack in the back seat, as if she needed to make sure it was there. Emily, once again, was silent, looking out the window. At one point, she commented that the teacher had said that that day would be important for the rehearsal of the most difficult scene. This phrase made the air even heavier inside the car. Linda and Karen had agreed that on that day, Linda would ask to help behind the scenes, saying that she could hold costumes or organize scripts, while Karen would stay in the hallway, next to the door, like the last time. Upon arrival, everything went almost as planned. Linda went to Daniel, commented that she had some free time that morning and that she would love to help behind the scenes of the play if he needed it. The teacher, apparently surprised, thanked him and said that it would be great to have one more adult around to organize the children. Smile, as always. There was no visible crack in her expression, but to Karen, that smile now looked more like a mask. The children entered the room, and Karen positioned herself in the hallway, once again with her cell phone in her hand, to disguise it, pretending to mess with messages. The recorder, silent inside Emily's backpack, was activated shortly before by Karen herself, at a time when her daughter was not paying attention. The discreet button had been pressed, and the device began to record all the sound captured on the way home to that stage. As the class went on, Karen listened outside only to bits of music, voices, scene direction. Time passed slowly, and at each pause she wondered if that would be the time when Daniel would do those special exercises again. Her hands were sweating, and her breathing was getting shorter and shorter. Linda, inside, helped the children to change positions, to find scripts, but also, in silence, she tried to observe everything, especially the moments when the lights changed and the teacher asked some students to stay on stage after the rest of the group spread out. That Saturday did not end with a blatant visual. Daniel, with Linda's presence inside, seemed more restrained. He didn't exercise in total darkness. He didn't ask anyone to be alone with him in a corner. This might have caused momentary relief, but for Karen, it was just another sign that things changed when there was another attentive adult in the room. And that was why, in the end, all the weight of that day would fall on what was engraved on the small device inside the backpack. When school was over, Karen drove Emily to her car, helped her daughter pack into the back seat, and made her way back. The sky was even more cloudy, and a stronger wind shook the trees in the street. Emily looked tired, but not as dejected as on other days. He answered his mother's questions in short sentences, saying that the rehearsal had been heavy, but important. Karen didn't dwell much on the conversation. Her head was on another point, the moment when she could finally hear what had happened inside. When she got home, she asked her daughter to take a hot shower and rest for a while, saying that she would arrange some things in the kitchen. When Emily entered the bathroom, Karen ran to her backpack, carefully unzipped it, and grabbed the small tape recorder. Her hands were shaking so much that she almost dropped the device. She went to the car, where she knew she could have more privacy for a few minutes, closed the driver's door, locked the car, and stood there, alone, with the device in her hands. The silence inside the car seemed different from the silence of the house. There, it was just her, the distant noise of the street and the sound of her own heart beating too fast. Karen plugged the headset into the recorder, took a deep breath, and pressed the button to play. At first, he heard only the background noise of the house, the sound of their voices on the way, snippets of music from the radio, the car moving. It was strange to hear her own voice from outside, asking if Emily was anxious, if she wanted to revise any lines. Then the sound changed. You could clearly hear the buzz of children arriving at the community center, footsteps down the hallway, doors slamming. Then came the sounds of the theater room. Scripts being flipped through, children laughing, Daniel giving general instructions. Everything seemed normal at first. He talked about the play, about the importance of each one, about commitment, about the courage to be on stage. Karen kept listening, her chest tightened, waiting for the moment when the class would split up and the special exercises would begin. Time seemed to take time to get to the stretch that really mattered. The recording continued, with excerpts of music being played on the piano, children's voices singing, some loose laughter. It was almost possible to forget for a few minutes the reason why he was there listening to everything. But, at a certain point, the dynamics changed. The music was interrupted more abruptly, the sound of footsteps approaching the microphone, as if Emily was being called closer. Then Daniel's voice appeared clearer, closer, as if it were a few meters from the recorder. He said something like, "Now let's work on the fear scene, the part that matters most to you." He asked the other children to move away a little, to sit further back, and made it clear that this would be a special moment. Karen felt an ice run through her entire body. The word "special" once again appeared there, now registered. He began to explain that sometimes the body trembles in the face of fear, but that the actor needs to learn to use this tremor in favor of the scene. He asked Emily not to back down, to let fear appear in her body. His voice at that moment had a strange tone, almost seductive, but disguised in theatrical language. Karen pressed the earphone to her ears, wanting to make sure she wasn't misinterpreting. Then she heard something that made her hands even colder. Emily's voice, weak, said in English with a childish accent, "I'm shaking, I don't like this." The sentence came out in a mixture of confession and request. She said clearly that she was shaking, that she didn't like it. Daniel's answer came quickly, firmly. He said that this was normal, that this is exactly what the scene needs, that she should continue, that she should not let fear spoil the process. Worse than that, at one point, he asked the girls not to tell their mothers about this type of exercise because mothers never understand what is necessary for the theatre. That sentence was like a punch in the pit of Karen's stomach. There was, in the form of sound, everything she feared. Someone using her daughter's trust, using the language of art and profession to create a bond of secrecy, keeping the girl away from the very one she should be involved with. She heard her own daughter say again, in an even weaker tone, "I'm shaking." The sound of trembling came in the voice, in the pauses between words. And on the other side, Daniel was heard ordering her to follow, to trust him, to not let the body rule at that moment. A tear fell from Karen's cheek straight into the steering wheel without her trying to hold on. Soon others came. She kept listening, even with her eyes watered in her eyes. At times, you could see that the other girls were also there, in the background, perhaps watching or participating in something similar. The professor used expressions such as, "You are special. This work is a stage secret. The public will never understand what happens here." Every use of the word "secret" hurt like a stab in the mother's chest. It was concrete proof that it wasn't just imagination, it wasn't just paranoia. Emily's body didn't just tremble from shyness or nervousness. There was a clear component of someone who pushed the girl into an emotional boundary she didn't want to cross, and used the fear of maternal disapproval as a tool to keep it hidden. When the recording advanced to the end, with the voices getting farther away, the sound of the class returning, the music restarting, Karen realized that the proof she was looking for was there. There was no image, there was no video, but there were words. There were direct phrases, requests not to tell the mothers, confessions that the daughter was shaking and did not like the scene, an adult's insistence on keeping everything behind the scenes. The recording ended with a passage in which Emily took a deep breath and forced a line from the play, her voice still trembling. Karen took off the headset with trembling hands, leaned her head against the back of the seat, and took a deep breath, trying to find air in the grip. The phrase that came to her mind was clear: "I was right, and now I can't be silent anymore." From that moment on, it was no longer possible to say to herself that perhaps it was an exaggeration, that perhaps she was interpreting signs. That recording was the point of no return. The horror was confirmed, not in the sense of some irreparable physical damage, but in the sense of manipulation, of invasion of the most intimate space of trust between a child and an adult. And while this discovery hurt, there was also, in the midst of the pain, a strange sense of relief. Relief for not being crazy, for not having invented everything, for seeing that maternal instinct had not screamed for nothing. The pain now turned into a decision. She knew that she would have to face people who didn't want to listen, that she would have to face the director of the community center, other mothers, maybe even be accused of overreacting. But she also knew that none of these difficulties could compare to the responsibility she had in front of her daughter. Before moving on to the next steps, before confronting authorities and exposing what he had discovered, there was still an important point in how this story would be told to the world. If you have come this far, it is because you understand that stories like this are not simple reports, but living alerts. And if you want other mothers to also learn to trust their own intuition, it is worth supporting this type of content, leaving your like, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, so that no woman feels alone when questioning something that everyone says is normal. When she turned off the tape recorder and wiped away her tears on the back of her hand, Karen knew she couldn't wait another day. Fear, which until then had been mixed with doubt, gave way to a clean anger, an anger that came from love and the feeling of having been deceived. He took out his cell phone, called Linda, and explained, in a still, trembling voice, what he had heard. He didn't need many details. Upon hearing the words, he asked them not to tell their mothers, and she said she was shaking and didn't like it. Linda was silent for a few seconds, and then said she needed to hear it with her own ears. They arranged to meet later that afternoon, in Karen's own car, parked on a quieter street near the community center. A few hours later, Linda was sitting in the passenger seat, her face serious, her hands clasped in her lap. Karen put on the headset, shared a side with her, and played it. The two listened together to the crucial passage, Daniel's voice leading to such a scene of fear, Emily's heavy breathing, the weak phrase in English, "I'm shaking, I don't like this," and his insistent response, asking to continue, saying that it was exactly what the scene needed, asking for secrecy about the method. When the audio got to the part where he said, in all the letters, that the mothers would not understand and that it was better not to comment to them, Linda put her hand to her mouth, shocked, her eyes filled with tears. Karen paused the audio. For a few moments, neither of them said anything. The silence inside the car was only broken by the noise of cars passing in the distance, by the wind hitting the trees. Then Linda took a deep breath and said that this was not theater. It was abuse of trust. It was child manipulation. She said that, listening to all that, she remembered loose phrases that her own daughter had said months before, about scenes in the dark, about getting too close to the teacher, about stage secrets. The two realized then that it was not just an isolated episode, it was a pattern. They decided that they would not go alone to the principal. Karen called two other mothers with whom she had more bond, briefly explained that there was a serious situation, that she needed to show something, and that it was a serious matter involving her daughters. At first, the women were confused, but they agreed to meet their friends the next day before class in a reserved room at the community center itself. Karen transferred the audio to her cell phone, made a backup, and spent the night awake, mentally rehearsing what she would say. The next morning, the sky was as heavy as Karen's head. He took Emily to the community center, but this time he didn't let his daughter into the class. He said that there would be an important meeting, which he would later explain better. The girl was anxious, not understanding, but her mother assured her that she would not leave her alone at any time. Linda did the same with her own daughter. The other two mothers also appeared, with the girls beside them, silently, looking at the four women with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The community center's director, a middle-aged man with a rumpled dress shirt and an ever-hurried expression, was called to an urgent meeting. He led them all to a simple room with light walls without much decoration, a long table in the center, plastic chairs around it, and a small window that overlooked the parking lot. There was an old coffee maker in a corner, but no one bothered to use it. Karen sat facing the director, with Linda next to her and the other mothers nearby. The girls stayed in an adjoining room, watched by a trusted employee, away from any contact with Daniel. When the principal asked the reason for the meeting, Karen felt her heart race, but decided to speak calmly. She said that she had noticed changes in her daughter, that she had observed some strange situations in class, that the insistence on exercises in the dark, with doors almost closed, bothered her. He told of the tape recorder, the difficult decision to put it in his backpack, and what he had heard. The man frowned, looked confused, almost offended, as if this were an accusation against the integrity of the center. When Karen mentioned the part where the teacher explicitly asked the girls not to talk to their mothers, his face started to turn paler. She then took her cell phone, connected it to a small speaker in the room, and warned that she would play a part of the audio. He asked them to listen to the end without interrupting. The director, with a tense expression, agreed. The other mothers leaned forward in silence. The file began to ring. The simple room, with plastic chairs and cold ceiling light, suddenly filled with Daniel's voice, clear, close, guiding the scene of fear, encouraging trembling, asking for blind trust. Then came Emily's voice, small and trembling, saying that she was shaking and that she didn't like it. The silence of the women hurt more than any comment. When the audio got to the part of "Don't tell your mothers, they won't understand," and "This is our secret, on stage, special," it was as if the air in that room became heavier. The director ran his hand over his forehead, which was beginning to sweat. The other mothers looked at each other, some with teary eyes, others with their mouths half open, shocked. Karen felt a kind of strength wash over her. It was as if, after so many days of swallowing fear and doubt, I finally had something solid, a truth that could no longer be swept under the rug. She paused the audio, looked directly at the director and said that this was not a misunderstanding. It was not just an exaggerated artistic choice. It was an adult breaking the basic trust between parents and children, using the word secret to create a wall between the girls and their own mothers. She said that as a nurse, she had seen many children carry guilt that was not theirs for years, for fear of speaking, and that he wouldn't let that happen to Emily. He firmly asked that the teacher be immediately removed from his position, that no child be alone with him for another minute, that the competent authorities be called to investigate the case. Linda reinforced, recalling her own daughter's previous complaints about weird exercises. The other two mothers, now equally shaken, admitted that they had also found some things weird, but had never put everything together to realize the size of the problem. It was as if they had all taken off a blindfold at the same time. The headmaster, pale, tried at first to say that perhaps it was an exaggeration, that the professor had a good reputation, that there had never been any formal complaints. But in front of the audio, the words came out weak. He knew that it would not be restricted to that room. At the slightest sign that it was trying to cover something up, the name of the community center would also be dragged into the mud. After a few minutes of hesitation, he admitted that the recordings were serious, that he needed to act responsibly. He said that he would call Daniel to explain himself, but that from now on his classes would be interrupted. Shortly after, the professor was called to the same room. He entered with the smile he always wore in the corridors, but when he saw the four mothers sitting, the director with a tense face and his cell phone still on the table, without the theatre script in hand, his expression changed subtly. He made a point of greeting everyone, but the gesture died in the air. He sat down, uncomfortable, and asked what was going on. Karen looked directly at him without looking away, something she had avoided doing out of respect and insecurity. She warned that she had something to show and pressed play again. The audio of his voice filling the room now sounded like a kind of mirror turned against him. With each sentence in which he encouraged the scene of fear, which asked for secrecy, which diminished the importance of mothers, the room seemed to shrink. At a certain point, he tried to interrupt, saying that it was out of context, that it was theatrical language, that he worked with immersion, that the method required it. But Karen continued, leaving no room for detours. When the audio got to the part where Emily said she was shaking and didn't want to continue, and he insisted that she follow, Daniel was visibly nervous. Sweat began to sprout on his forehead, running down the side of his face. He tried to laugh forcefully, saying that in the theatre fear is part of it, that children sometimes confuse rehearsal with reality. That is why he talked so much about confidence. The word method came out of his mouth more than once, like an anchor to which he tried to cling. It was then that Karen, with a firm voice, cut off any justification. He said that no method authorizes an adult to ask a child to keep his mother's secret, that no artistic technique in the world justified putting a 9-year-old girl on a dark stage, shaking, saying she didn't like it, and still insisting that she continue. That asking for silence about what happens in a classroom is the exact opposite of a safe space. She stared at him and said, without raising her tone, but with a firmness that no one in that room had seen in her before, that he would never go near Emily again. That direct look, that phrase, was the point at which the teacher's mask began to fall off for good. Daniel tried to defend himself, saying that it was all just a misunderstanding, that mothers were taking it the wrong way, that they lived in a hypersensitive world where no one understood what art was anymore. But the more he talked, the more he got tangled. The other mothers also began to question him about phrases that his own children had brought home. The principal, seeing the situation worsen, interrupted to say that from that moment on, Daniel was suspended without access to the classes until a complete investigation was carried out. Karen asked, right then and there, for the police to be called. Not for now, to accuse him of a specific crime, but for the case to be documented, for the recordings to be analyzed, for other families to be heard, with the support of those who have the legal duty to protect children. The director hesitated for a while, but eventually agreed. He knew that any attempt to resolve it internally would be seen as connivance. In a short time, a car arrived at the community center's parking lot. The police listened to a summary, copied the audio, collected the first statements. While all this was happening, Emily and the other girls still did not know the dimension of what was going on. They were in another room, drawing, trying to understand why that Saturday was so different from the others. Karen felt a mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt for not having noticed before, for not having fully trusted the first tremor she saw, for having let her daughter into that room so many times. Relief for having acted now, for not having let another week, another month pass, until perhaps it was too late. The history of that drama school in Boston took a new turn from that day on. The news soon appeared on small local websites, in groups of mothers in the neighborhood, in conversations at the doors of other schools. Suddenly, there were reports of families who always found strange some behavior, but had never had the courage to speak. Karen saw all this with a mixture of sadness and strength. The sadness came from realizing that so many signs were scattered, but were ignored for fear of seeming exaggerated. The strength came from the certainty that now no one could say that it was just imagination. Police have opened a formal investigation. The community center issued a statement suspending Daniel from all activities, as a precaution, until everything was clarified. In subsequent meetings, local authorities reinforced the importance of always having more than one adult in activities with children, of never allowing closed doors without supervision, of making it clear to families how each dynamic worked. The case, although it had not turned into a scandal of major proportions in the entire city, served as a strong alarm for that specific community. In Emily's life, the consequences were also profound, but not only negative. Soon after the episode, Karen decided that her daughter would need help to deal with the fear, with the memories, with the words she had heard and repeated. She looked for a child therapist recommended by a work friend, a professional used to hearing stories of children who went through confusing experiences, who did not know if they had the right to feel uncomfortable. The first sessions were difficult. Emily, shy, had difficulty putting into words what she felt. Often I drew the stage, the lights, the shadows, and only after some time did I start talking about fear, trembling, shame. Karen, in turn, learned to listen not only to what her daughter said, but to what was between the lines. She understood, with pain, how many times the girl had felt something strange and swallowed so as not to disappoint Mr. Collins, so as not to disturb the play, not to be seen as weak. He also realized how children often feel a responsibility to protect adults, not to cause problems, and so they keep secrets they shouldn't carry. This made her repeat countless times at home that between mother and daughter there is no secret, that it is an obligation, that any discomfort could and should be shared. Over time, Emily returned to doing theatre, but elsewhere. Karen found a smaller school in another neighborhood, where the doors were open, where there were always 2 adults in the room, where parents were invited to attend the rehearsals eventually, not just the final presentations. The first time she took her daughter to this new space, her heart tightened. Seeing the stage, the lights, the chairs, everything seemed to bring back what had happened. But little by little, the laughter of the other children, the light way the new teacher spoke, the presence of other parents in the audience helped to create new memories. 1, 2, 3 years later, the marks of that story still existed, but in a different way. They were no longer open wounds, they were scars that resembled a danger avoided in time. The affair with Daniel ran its course. The police investigation found other girls who reported discomfort, similar phrases about secrets and exercises in fear. Even if a proven physical crime had not been reached, community pressure, evidence of emotional manipulation, and the breach of trust with minors caused him to be removed from working with children for good. The reputation of beloved teacher gave way to a name that no one else proudly mentioned. Karen, on the other hand, has come to be seen by many mothers as a kind of silent reference, not in the sense of a distant heroine, but as someone who, despite the fear of judgment, chose to follow the inner voice. She began meeting with other women in the neighborhood, first in informal gatherings in cafes and kitchens, then in small groups organized at the local church. They talked about warning signs in teachers, coaches, community leaders. They shared stories of when they felt something was wrong and were discouraged from making trouble. In schools and spaces in the neighborhood, the attitude of adults has also changed. Some teachers had more careful looks when a child said he did not want to be alone with someone, when he was uncomfortable with a specific activity. Directors began to listen more respectfully when a mother said, "There's something strange," instead of dismissing it at the beginning as too sensitive. And from time to time, a comment appeared in message groups about how the case of the theatre teacher had served as a lesson for everyone. At home, Emily grew up. Gradually, the stage ceased to be a place of fear and returned to being a space of expression and joy. The girl learned, with the support of her mother and therapist, to identify when something made her uncomfortable and to say no more easily. She learned that no talent requires silence over fear, that no scene is worth the anguish of trembling alone in a dark room. Karen, in turn, learned to observe not only what her daughter said, but the pauses, the looks, the changes in behavior that could not be explained with a simple "I'm tired." The two created a habit that they maintain to this day. From time to time, they sit at the kitchen table with a mug of hot chocolate or tea, turn off the television, and agree that it is time for unfiltered conversation. At that moment, anything can be said, without fear of judgment. If something bothers Emily at school, in a new course, in a friendship, that's the safe space to talk. And Karen, when she listens, remembers with bitter gratitude the day when a small device hidden in her backpack turned the key to everything. Karen never forgot the sound of her own daughter's voice, recorded on that small device hidden in her backpack, saying between sobs that she was shaking and didn't want to continue that dark scene on stage. That audio became a wound, and at the same time, a proof that a mother's instinct is not exaggeration. It is a shield. It is an alarm that God puts inside the chest to sound when something is wrong, even if everyone around insists on calling it drama or a child's nervousness. After the teacher was removed and the investigation began, Karen spent many nights sitting on the edge of Emily's bed, watching the girl sleep hugging a stuffed animal, the room now silent, without theatre lines repeated softly, without that fear of closing her eyes and seeing the dark stage again. She thought about how many times she had doubted herself, remembered the conversations in the parking lot, the other mothers laughing and saying that the teacher was a find, that it was rare for someone so dedicated in the neighborhood, and felt a pinch for almost having believed more in his fame than in the trembling of his daughter's hands. Over time, Emily started smiling again. She started doing theatre at another school, where parents can watch everything with open doors, lights on, clear laughter, no secrets behind the curtain. Karen learned to ask more, to listen to pauses, to notice the downcast gaze, the silence that says more than any word. She realized that true trust is not measured by how much we give our children with our eyes closed to someone, but by how much we allow them to speak when something bothers them, without fear of disappointing adults who seem important. She began to speak openly with other women in church, in the supermarket, in the mail line, telling that it was her own daughter who saved her from closing her eyes. That tremor in the rehearsal, that script falling to the ground, was a scream that no one heard except her. Many mothers thanked her for sharing this pain, for remembering that there is no exaggeration when it comes to protecting a child, that no title, no applause, no good reputation is worth more than the peace of a 9-year-old girl who just wanted to play at being an actress without feeling fear. Some confided old stories of suspicions they swallowed for fear of making mistakes, and promised themselves that from then on they would take seriously any discomfort that their children showed, no matter how small it seemed. Others began to observe extracurricular activities better, asking who stayed with the children, how the doors were used, if there were times when adults and children were isolated unnecessarily. Today, when Emily walks onto a lighted stage, Karen still feels her heart race, but now from pride and relief, not dread. She sees her daughter holding the microphone, speaking firmly, laughing with her classmates, and remembers the girl who trembled in silence, swallowing her fear so as not to disappoint a teacher. He remembers, especially, the day in Boston when, faced with everyone's doubt and his own desire not to cause trouble, he chose to be on the side of his daughter's trembling and not the perfect image of a man loved by the community. This choice didn't save just one girl. It saved many others who may never know how much they owe to a mother who refused to be silent. And you who have followed this story so far may also have an old tightness in your chest, some situation that once seemed too strange to be ignored and at the same time too difficult to face. Perhaps she has been called exaggerated, dramatic, mother who sees things where there is none. But stories like Karen and Emily's exist to remind us that feeling fear for the protection of a child is not weakness, it is strength. That hearing an "I'm afraid of him" whispered in the middle of a rehearsal can hurt, but it hurts much more to close your eyes and pretend you didn't hear. If this narrative stirred something inside, if it reminded you that a mother's instinct is not a fantasy, it is a tool. It is worth not letting this feeling die when the video ends. Don't go out. Take the next step in this journey by watching the next video on our channel, which will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to discover stories that touch the heart and show, in practice, how a mother's love can change entire destinies. A big hug, and see you in the next exciting story. Because none of us was born to be silent in the face of fear, but to protect those we love the most, one day at a time.